Welcome to another edition of Feed the Trolls. We've been taking a little bit of a break, but we're back and we're going to be getting super nerdy about Counter-Strike today. Thorin's obviously with us. And we also have Lurppis, which I think that there's a couple of people that might be watching who I like to call them COVID gamers. They kind of only got into Counter-Strike after COVID, after lockdown. You're probably looking at that face right now going, I have no idea who this person is. Don't worry, we'll help you along. He has played at the top level. He's been one of the top commentators / analysts. He's been in the broadcast world. He's also done the business side. Lurppis, what are you up to now, though? What is it that you actually do? What is your day job, if you like?
I'm currently actually in school, so I'm going to Stanford. Just what I've been doing for the last 18 months, and then starting an investing role next year. So that's what I'm going to do after. And then in the meantime, I'm still working on all the esports things that I was involved with. So Immortals, some MIBR, ends, etc. So a bit of everything, to be honest.
Mainly financial role, though, for people who don't know, because
Yeah.
people always think you're like a GM or something. He's on the finance side, guys.
Yeah, I read about the player changes on HLTV, same as everybody else.
But understanding the big business side of it, which I actually think is something that most people don't understand, is how much the running an organization actually costs, how much is involved in scouting players, making those right decisions, which kind of feeds quite nicely into what we want to talk about tonight.
Yes.
So a couple of weeks ago, there was an HLTV article that came out. Nero, we've had him on the show before, did this really great thing about the data revolution that needs to happen in Counter-Strike. And he linked it back to traditional sports and how important it is to use that data to scout players, to determine what the best positions would be, and to get into all of that. So let's just do a broad conversation about this right now. I mean, how important is data, do you think, when it comes to forming a Counter-Strike team, when it comes to looking at players? How much of their stats are you paying attention to? I mean, Thorin, I'll throw it to you first as a broadcast analyst, and when you're doing content, how much attention are you paying to the numbers?
I mean, I would say generally I'm not a huge stats guy. I always describe stats for me as it's like I view stats as a question that I then have to watch the game to answer with reasons. Oftentimes there'll be intangible reasons, like why did this player not work out when their numbers were good in another team? You have to look at things like how did they play in the team? What style of leadership do they have? Who are they as a person? That sort of jazz. But I will say I'm not a huge stats guy generally, but I will say I do think it has had an overall in esports and sports, the biggest effect possible. If people don't know, even if people who don't follow all the sports, the most famous sport that people probably know has been changed completely by stats and analytics alone is basketball. Basically, if you ever look at a shot chart of a player from now or 20 years ago, it's almost inverted, quite literally. The entire game was inside the 3-point arc. It was all 2-point mid-range game, whereas now, it's unironically about finding the best 3-point shot. Similarly, if people don't know, in football, people don't tend to concretize this that much, but in football, what sort of ruined football is they literally came up with their own superstar. It's called expected goals, and their religion basically became you place your expected goals as high as possible all the time. Now, the downside of that is all of your favorite goals in football where someone blasts it from 30 yards out, that's a terrible expected goal, even if you're the best player in the world, it turns out. So unfortunately, it will mean, even though it'll make the average team better, it will mean you don't do the best possible plays because they're not actually high expectation value, essentially. So I would say it's an area where it's more a topic I'm interested in actually from other people who are the experts and how do they see the world, because I do acknowledge it does have an enormous impact. I think I'm just more of a traditionalist and sort of I'm more on the art side of esports than the science side in that sense.
Lurppis, how about you?
So, I mean, honestly, it's really hard to watch Counter-Strike from California. I typically get to watch the second semifinal or the last quarterfinal of most events because the last World Final first match started at 1 a.m. The semifinal, the second game started at 4 a.m. And it's actually not that much better for many of the European events. So it's just hard to follow from California. It's not surprising to me that the North American scene is doing so poorly because it's just really hard to follow the game no matter how much you care about it. You really got to orient your life around it sometimes to be able to catch it, and it's going to be the same for the Shanghai Major. So I think I probably, just because of that, have looked at stats way more in the last, call it 5 years that I've lived in the US, 6 years, whatever it's been, because it's just hard to see as much. And that's one way of kind of aggregating and seeing what's going on. in terms of picking players, I think it's like a useful heuristic when you're just like trying to come up with like ideas of like, if you have no idea who you're gonna pick, you know, if you're sort of like a middling team, I would imagine that you go scour HLTV and be like, hey, like see some ideas, or like similarly, you go look at like the FPL standings, or like who are there, like who are doing well on like some metric as like initial point. I don't think there is any sort of coherent way of turning those numbers into like a useful analysis. So you can look at Monesi's numbers and know he's incredible and like one of the best ever. But I think it's, you know, I would love to see somebody try to make a case for like why Hunter is meaningfully better than like some other third best player of like a really good team. Like there's no way. And so I think it's a useful heuristic. I don't think you can really build anything solely based on that, based on what's available today. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't improve what you do with the data, which I'm sure we'll get to in a second, and make it more useful. But I don't think what you have available today is particularly useful at all.
Yes.
It's sort of just like a starting point.
Yes.
In terms of what you don't have, though, so this was something I was thinking about. This game is, if you know how to pull what you need from it, it is ultimately a game. It's not like a basketball or football where you're going to need this like sort of insane look at it and all this different understanding and analysis. You could pull a lot of this if you know what scripts to write, I presume. And again, I also come from, I like the stories and I like what I can see on the screen. So data's not my strong point, but I was thinking about it and I was like, surely if you could find the right people, you could pull a lot from this game.
Here's the funny thing I didn't tell you before, which is Lurppis, a while back now, we're talking like 7-8 years ago, he was actually involved with a group of people who were making like essentially a stats analyzer. And I can tell you, even back then, this is why I knew this topic would be interesting. The idea that like HLT themselves are like, hey, we could revolutionize data. It's like, yeah, no shit, you're the ones keeping it in a fucking castle in the top flight with the hair hanging down Rapunzel's. Can we come into the castle? Because basically the analyzer thing I'm talking about that Lurppis worked with years ago, it's called 16-0. You could already pull almost every possible imaginable stat, as in unironically, Sam, the filters were so good. You could literally do a stat like, I want to know when these two teams play in Overpass and this exact fight happens of a guy coming out of the monster tunnel and fighting a guy at the barrel, like what percentage headshots does he, like you can find every possible stat. It was crazy. The problem is though, Tommy, I think the bigger issue is it's almost like, I'd give the analogy I'm sure people can relate to. You know, when you go, there's nothing on TV, but the joke is you're just scrolling through hours. You just can't find like, but it's like you get overwhelmed by how much that you could watch though. And the problem is because nothing's the best one, you go, but I could watch that and I'll save that. You maybe got, I think that's the problem with data. It's like, well, there's a sea of data. And what we don't have is like the algorithms don't have like a set stat that does something for us, or like a super formula or something. That's the real issue. Is like, I think actually we haven't used the data at all for me. It's almost just been left out there.
And I mean, that's the reason why people look at the HLTV rating, because that is just like a single number that they can look at and compare across everybody, as opposed to all these like very detailed numbers. Yeah, I think like you have access to just about everything. Like there's no reason why analytics in Counter-Strike shouldn't be way better than in every traditional sport, because you just, you know, like obviously like NBA teams now have these like camera systems that record like, you know, 60 frames per second all around the court and like, you know, cost millions to install. In CS you just get that for free.
Just in the game, you can check any single unit in the game basically, can't you?
But the real issue is, like you said, there's too much information. It's really hard to figure out what's actually valuable. And I think there's also like big part of what would be valuable to know about players is stuff that you need out of game data to handle. So like one thing that comes to mind just like directly is like, if I were running a team and I was trying to do this, we can talk about why I wouldn't be doing this in a second. But if I were running a team and I were trying to do some of this stuff, one thing I would do is I would want to use one of these like new machine learning models to analyze comms. Because one thing that is, you know, like you can kind of figure out like who's good based on like FPL. Like you can see like who has good aim. You can run a bunch of the stats of, like, you know, like what their reaction time is, like how many milliseconds it takes for them to aim on somebody's head, like all this stuff. You can, you know, like if I was paid enough money, like I'm pretty sure I could figure out enough of those things that it would correlate pretty strongly with somebody being a good player. It would just take some time and money. But the other thing that's still missing, and I think that's hard for some of the people that get plucked up from the FPL, is communication and team play. So like the other layer would be, you know, there's one thing to say like, are you good at trading? But like, maybe you were never supposed to trade in the first place. Maybe it's the other guy's fault. But if you combine that with comms, which I think with the new machine learning models probably wouldn't be very hard to do for somebody who's actually good at working with that stuff, you could then figure out, it's like if I called for Duncan to be right behind me and trade, and he still just like falls behind, doesn't do anything, like then we know it's his fault.
Yes.
If Duncan sees the guy to the right of Monster, I peek after, I was blind, I don't see on the radar, I go out and I die for no reason, then I know he should have combat and I died because of that. But that's the kind of context that you don't really have from just demos. And I think that part actually, in many ways, is a lot more valuable, because I think it's much easier to pick up the, like, do you have good aim? Like, do you have decent game sense? Like that, you can just watch a couple of games and I'll have a pretty good sense of like, like usually like one best of three of somebody I haven't really seen play. If he's shown enough, you can kind of get a sense of like, is this a good player or not? It's the other stuff that's much harder, that takes a lot longer. And so I actually think the most valuable piece of all of this would be that kind of stuff, sort of like the derivatives of all
By
those
the way,
things.
interesting detail. This is actually some super secret inside baseball shit. So I'm not calling anyone out for not knowing this, but actually not that long ago, I'll say like within the last 2 months, a coach, I won't say who because I don't think it's public yet, but there's a coach in CS who actually, his company basically works on a program that does exactly what you're talking about. It does things like when you play a scrim, it records the comms as well as the demo, but it like time syncs it all basically. And then it can do, like you're saying, it has like a machine learning element where it'll do things like, look, obviously it depends on what team you're in. If you're in a Russian team, you're going to communicate very differently than a Danish team, for example. But you can sort of set the filters and what like the pacing should be. And it allows you to tell things like, is someone being like unusually silent on a specific map? Or like, as you're saying, if the difference is you could actually run that back. And in the scenario you're talking about, we could go to the actual comms when we were coming out the monster pipe, like you're saying. And if you called for me to do something and you see in the game I don't respond and I don't do it, it's a very easy way you could immediately like identify a flaw in the game. Whereas you're right, if in that scenario, to take the same analogy and make the point, if in that analogy I didn't flash for you or whatever, and then you died, but I got a 2K, well, to someone on the box score, it looks like I did the right thing, didn't I? You're the one who fucked up in that sense. So I see what you mean. I agree. There is like definitely a layer that like in the past we thought only humans could analyze, that you can do like 80% of it with a machine, basically.
Yeah, but might even be more now, depending on how sophisticated you can build these models. I mean, like, just if you like think about all the stuff that you could do with comms, for example, there's a pretty big difference between you having a call out for like a very specific way to hold an angle. And like that, those are the kind of spots that you might like name after a player. It's usually like somebody who got a highlight playing that spot. You call it like Monesi or something, or Nico. But it's very different if I go and die and I tell you that the player is in Nico or he's in like this big general area. And that's like another thing that's like, one, that's actually hard to correct with people, because like unless you record comms, like people get pretty defensive about this stuff. It's pretty hard to tell them after the game, like, hey, remember when you called that out wrong? Like, here's, if you told me that I could have pre-fired, we win the round. That's hard to correct. If you, on the other hand, could just like automatically pull together sort of like, like thinking like traditional sports, like a 2-minute clip after the game on like the practice day of like, hey, here's the big mistakes. Like, can we just not do, like, everybody just focus these things and we'll be 10% better. You do that over and over and over and over again for a year, you obviously get like massive improvements on just like building that. So I think those kind of things actually probably are where you would get more of the benefit. But it's also, unsurprisingly, it's like one layer harder. Like, it's not all that, it's like useful for like media purposes to have like a bunch of these crafts that like HLTV puts out on like, oh, look at these guys, like these guys are good at trading, like these are good at this, and like here's the entry kill percentage. But that lacks a lot of the context, and it's not actually the stuff that would be most useful in evaluating players, which is very different from just sort of gauging like who's a good player versus who you want to potentially actually pick up or who would be a fit for your team.
Do you think that's the downfall, though? I mean, just to summarize what we're saying here, because I want to get into the comms conversation and all of that as well. But for me, I can only talk from being on a desk with quote unquote analysts, where we're sort of looking at a game, and it's my pet peeve when we bring up map win percentages, and someone says something random well, this team has a 70% win rates on this map, and this this team has a 40%. Cool, but who's the opposition they're playing? How many times have they played this map in the last 3 months? Are we actually measuring? You're just throwing out a number because you found it on HLTV. And I feel like this is a position we could be in, which is kind of dangerous when we talk about this data for coaches or teams that maybe aren't kind of thinking about bigger picture. It is very easy to go, oh, look, we have all this data, and there are now various paid for programs you can use that'll give you all of that data as well. that's how we're going to make our decisions. But you're getting very little context from the numbers. They're just numbers on the screen. Is that kind of where do you think we're sitting with Counter-Strike?
I mean, put it this way, one thing I do think is a problem is like, my joke there would be, the good news there is I'll always have a job because I'll always be the guy who goes, well, actually, Sam, if you look at their overpass, you'll find that they played 3 of the top teams on it. So the 40% win rate's not actually legitimate. They're actually better. First of all, I can do that. But then more importantly, I actually do agree. That's why the HLTV thing, look, I'll put all cards on the table because Nero actually seems like one of the cooler HLTV people. And by the way, he actually seems very earnest. He genuinely does seem to have that naive young person's thing of like, hey guys, why can't we all just get along and have a brilliant team? Which is like, I love that for the first few years, before they get bitter and jaded and hate everyone and realize why the world doesn't work that way. But I love the energy, loving that, keep that. But the downside is, like I said, the real problem is like, it's your bosses that are doing it all. Because like, I'll tell you an example of something he did recently, Nero actually. But this is insane, Lurppis. We didn't have this until 2024. Are you ready? This is going to blow your mind, but it actually is mind blowing that we didn't have this. He actually created the first real database of just what positions people even play on CT side. Bro, you know how I've done 70 plus lands, right? We've never ever had a graphic of who even plays the spots. So when we have any discussion you can ever put on the table, best entry players, the best CT anchor, like we're just having convos that are worse than the map one. We're talking about best CT anchor, but we're comparing a guy who plays like B Mirage against a guy who plays like fucking like, like a different position on like Anubis or something like there's not, that's like, that is literally chalk and shit. It doesn't even make sense to compare those two things. But we're acting like there's some uniform number that tells you who's the best. I mean, if people don't know, there was even a similar thing he once did where he showed, I think last year, which CT spots get the most kills on average. Bro, that's not even something an average player knows. We take for granted if you're a top level person, roughly like Connected Mirage is a great CT. A pleb doesn't get that. Like, he really just looks at your HLTV rating and thinks you did well or badly. Like, this is an example where the data is there. We just don't access it currently. Don't you think that's crazy? I mean, the most extreme version, Sam, isn't even position. It's where sometimes on a desk to this day, unless that team is friendly with Liquipedia, you might not even know who the IGL is. That's real. You can have a game where, because no one asked him in an interview, we don't even know who's the IGL. Like, imagine doing an American football game, you don't know who's going to be like the fucking wide receiver or something. That would be insane. You couldn't even do the sport like that. It's actually somewhat a testament how good we are on camera that we get away without having any of this shit.
I was gonna make a political joke about being good on camera, but
okay.
I'll refrain for a few days. I guess this will come out after, so it might be okay. Yeah, I mean, I there's just so many of those things that I think you could do a whole lot better on. On the other hand, like, I think it's a little bit unfair to expect the media side of this to be leading, in the sense that you like, if you think about any of this, like, the people who are going to put in the money to figure the stuff out are the people who might actually make money out of it.
Oh, sure, yes.
Like, we both know that, like, you get like some marginal viewers if the broadcast segment is better. Like, you get like some new clips. Like, there's some people who enjoy it more, but they're not paying more. They're maybe watching the ads, and like many of them are tuning out. So like, there's little incentive for the media or the broadcast side to make those stats better.
But is it, unironically, it's actually better for the broadcast for me just to go, I think jail's just shit, than go like, on this position he didn't quite play. Like, that's the second one's less interesting. It gets less views. It does, you're right.
Yeah. So then we go back to like, how could this get resolved? And a lot of it is like, you kind of need somebody to just like put money into it and like get like a couple of smart people to do it.
Do you think someone has to succeed? Does it have to be like some money bullshit and you actually like succeed from it and that's why you do it? Does something have to like force the teams to do it, you think?
Well, I think like, if you don't have to put money into it, like if you think about where the industry has been since COVID, like nobody is gonna put, I mean, like there's like a difference between if you hire this coder in like Romania or California, but like, you're paying those people $500,000 a year. It's more than any of your players to have somebody good at doing that. Maybe if you are from like a lower cost of living region, you can get by cheaper, though. Like, that advantage is also going away with remote work, particularly for that industry. So, the cost is pretty high to try to do it. And if you try to do it, the benefits are probably like several years out to being realized. So like, you actually need somebody who's going to be willing to pour a bunch of money into it for like potentially like 3 to 5 years before you hopefully have like some success cases. Because it's just like hard to know. Like, maybe you spend a year, like everything works out great. You only spend a year developing it. That probably costs you, $500,000, something like that to begin with. And then you need a situation where like you're actually building a team. And like a lot of the time, the one difference between esports and traditional sports is you don't have subs. And so it's much harder to put together a team than in like, football or basketball, where like, if somebody's good, like they're going to get to play some number of minutes. They might not be a starter, but they'll be like a solid role player. Like, you can pencil them in for like 15 minutes in the playoffs and like take some time off the good players. Like, that's how it works. That's not how it works in Counter-Strike. If somebody like just doesn't work together on that team, like they're not only are they useless, you probably sign them to a contract that you can't get out of for free.
Yes.
So you've actually lost money on that. So you can't hoard assets the same way that you can in basketball. I mean, like Daryl Morey is like nowadays the most famous analytics guy in basketball, and like his whole premise for like building a team is like you just get stars.
Yes.
Like, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter if they fit together. It doesn't matter what people think of them. It doesn't matter what the contracts are, because the league is all about stars. So like you can trade for Paul George, like you get Paul George, and like if it doesn't work out, you figure something out.
Yes.
But you'd still rather have Paul George than like 3 role players.
I mean, it's an asset you can always trade it,
exactly.
Right? Even if it's not good, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like,
sure.
You don't really have the same thing in Counter-Strike. You might just get stuck with a lot of these players. You're paying the salary. So not only do you have to prove like the counterfactual of that you would not have done as well without the information. Like, I feel like the only way is, one, you need to get somebody who's like willing to sort of pay for it out of their own pocket to do it. Like, that's kind of the only way to have like the investment available for that for a long enough period of time without any results. And you'd probably need like the same company person, whoever is running it, to get like a couple of big wins, like pick out like some sort of like middling guy.
I mean, you need it to be like
somewhere.
Blade says he did it for Navi, and that's why his team won or some shit, right?
Yeah, like you need something like that, I think,
sure.
to open the door, and then like maybe you get into it. But the challenge is that it's just a long time period, and like the amount of money to do it, like there's still like like valuable technology type stuff. Like the people who can build these models, like they can make a lot of money out in the real world. So it's not like a hobby thing. Somebody who's like 20 and in college has got to build a lot of. I mean, some people could if they're just like.
By the way,
but most of them won't.
Also, as a quick aside, I think I referenced it on a past episode, but actually in League of Legends, and so I can tell you in CS, people are working on these as far as I know. In League of Legends, they actually do currently, in European League of Legends, have like an analyzer tool that a guy made. I think he was from like Rogue or one of those teams. And basically, they claim this tool, I think it's mainly just for things like mechanics and how you lane in League of Legends, but they claim that essentially, because it represents all data, like you can do it within your region, within the whole world, within your role, and all those, you set all the same parameters essentially. And they claim that actually has been quite you would think, again, it's pure stats based things. What could that relevant show? Supposedly that has scouted a whole bunch of players that otherwise would have been like a faceless guy in a crowd, but you could just tell from this analyzer, like, holy shit, he's like 99th percentile at this thing here. And then they tried those people, and it just actually has, like, I would say, it's obviously not perfect, but it has like a fairly good correlation for how many times that did turn out to be like a secret talent. So I feel like in CS there's got to be something comparable that someone must be working on, where again you could just like check all the FPL people. And again, it wouldn't be like you'd actually, like, the analyzer wouldn't tell you, sign this player. It'd be more like it'd tell you the 5 best of the 50 players. And you wouldn't waste your time with the other 45. You'd look at the 5 good ones, and then you select as a human which one was good. So I feel like that has to be coming too. That just feels obvious.
Yeah, I do think somebody's gonna do it. And like, by the way, like more and more of these things are becoming available off the shelf. Like, you don't have to build, like, the reason we built like a lot of those things in 16.0 was like the guy who was actually coding it is just like a borderline genius. Like, he did machine learning at Stanford like before this whole boom. Like
10 years ago or something.
Yeah, he works at like one of the biggest algorithmic hedge funds now, and has been working for like one. Like that's why he stopped working on it, because he took that job. So like that was like a unique situation where he just had access to somebody who punches like so far above other people's weight. And,
he's
like,
overqualified.
Yeah, and like he just loves CS. Like he loves watching it. So like he'll set his alarm in the morning, like still to like watch some big games, and I'll talk to him about it. So like for him, it's just like a hobby. And like he built that like in the evenings after he did his real work for just like fun, but he was so productive that he could get it done reasonably quickly. Like that's just like a rare circumstance. But like these days, so many of these things are, one, way cheaper, two, more available. You just have like more things to build off of, that I think it's way cheaper. So like I do think somebody's gonna do it. I just think for like a broad acceptance, like you need like a trust the process type thing. And like I talked to Sam Hinkie about it, and like that's like a it's of course different in like traditional sports. Like the amount of media scrutiny you get out of that is unbelievable compared to some of this stuff. But like you know, like that was like in hindsight, like a very successful thing. Like, sure, like Embiid hasn't ended up winning all that much, but like that franchise turned into like one of the best franchises in the NBA for like
years. They were very
like
deep as well. Yeah,
like Trust the Process was a success. Like, no question about it. And like, if you ask him, like, he'll agree that he thinks it worked. I don't think he thinks it was worth the pain of like, you know, all the stuff that came.
By the way, that's also a very good example, because I think actually people use that trust the process as like a meme. But I agree. Actually, if you look at what it attempted to accomplish, at the end of the day, all the GM can do is put the players in there. They have to do the rest. Like, I think he did a very good job. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, look, it's I think you said this earlier in this episode. It's like all you can do is just like increase the expected value of things. Like, there's no certainty in any of this. Like, even if you have all the best players, like, you look at like how much Falcons is paying their players, like the players that they have access to, and like they've got a lot of good players. Just like hasn't worked out. Like, why? Like, I don't know. Like, they don't know. If they knew why it's not working, like they would have fixed it. Like, a lot of people thought it was gonna be way better. I don't think anybody would have taken this level of performance if you just relied on like something at the beginning of the year. Like, no way. Like, everybody would have thought they would have figured it out. So like, there is always just a component of it's path dependent, in the sense that like if they win the first tournament, maybe actually they just get very confident they play really well the whole time. Then you get a couple of things going wrong and it just sort of, you know, goes off the rails. But like, that's all you can really do is just like improve the odds. Ultimately, it's not flipping coin because you have control, but you know, it is just a probability play. Like, you know, maybe you have, you know, like all the big games in big tournaments are like 60-40, 55-45, like 65-35 at most. Like, you know, you have to run the math. If you just like simulate that, you get a lot of weird outcomes, which is, I mean, what you see, but you don't really realize that when you're evaluating something like that, because you're maybe buying, I don't know, like 10 percentage points on like some outcome. And like, what is that 10 percentage points worth? I don't know.
So there is obviously, I only know of Skybox as a company where you can pull analytics and data, and I'll get my 10% commission for trying to sell it from Anders in a little bit. But in terms of like, if you're a team.
By the way, this is where if you're a friend of someone in esports, you can be like a bit of an arsehole to them. Because I always said, because everyone was always telling him like, oh, really, it's like a real company now. You've got all employees. And I just say like, yeah, but to be fair, he is still doing the event, so it can't be making that much cash. So just saying, Anders, I'm just saying, mate, if you're like making millions of it, you probably wouldn't do events. So just saying, you know, just put that out there. It's all good. We love you.
In the article that the article that inspired this topic, Ash from Gamer Legion actually talks about how he uses Skybox to scout players, and I was like, Gamer Legion, but your results are not good enough. Okay. This is not a good advert for Skybox. We need to be careful here. But if I was running a team, right? So obviously, if you look at the big sports teams, they hire their own data analysts. That's their thing, right? Because you want to get the data and you want to use it in a way that can benefit you. But I was trying to think about this, and I was like, I just can't imagine, other than maybe Falcons, any team in Counter-Strike having the funds to hire someone to be able to do this at the level that it needs to be done. And on top of that, not only do you have to find a data analyst, surely you need to find someone who understands analyzing data and doing that, but also who has some sort of interest or knowledge about Counter-Strike, because I can't imagine you can just hire a data analyst and hope for the best. Sure. They would have to have an understanding of the game, right? So like, how many people in the world?
Oh, you've already made the Venn diagram insane, haven't you? Like the overlap of like must have like mathematical understanding. Also must have like that's like the smallest overlap in the fucking universe, basically. I mean, the joke is half the players who play pro in CS don't even fucking buy correctly based on the most basic flowchart patterns we invented about 20 years ago. They still buy incorrectly. So yeah, it's going to be a very, very small group of people. I'm with you on that. Here's the thing, though. There's a reason. I think Lurppis nailed it earlier. The real problem is this. In the short term, if it's perceived that it has almost no, like, meaningful effect or a tiny effect, no one's going to spend 200 grand on this, right? But the problem is, if you actually are a team like Na'Vi, FaZe, G2, if you actually spend the 200k and it has a big effect, you just save $2 million of transfers and buyouts and rebuild. Like, that's the problem. The stupidest part about this is, I agree, the actual hardest part is going to be sort of breaking the paradigm that this is even a real thing, like coaching. But if you ever do, the floodgates will open and everyone will have these teams, because like I say, I actually think the number one thing in Counter Counter-Strike that we've learned over the past few years. And by the way, the hack for this currently is called just academy players. It's that you can't really keep making super teams where everyone gets maximum market value, because then you have to win like everything. Otherwise, it's not even worth it. You lose money anyway. So in the current modern day, what people actually need to do is they need to actually avoid the odd massive buyout. Yeah, look, if you buy a Nico or Simple or Zemu, you don't mind paying for it. It's almost guaranteed you get the performance. But the real problem, as Falcon showed, is you can't be spending that sort of money for Sun Bias and Madden. You know, these are the players where actually you probably should have had a data science team go, this guy is like a 10K buyout from a tier 3 team, but he can do what Madden can do 98%, like a la something like Moneyball. In that scenario, that's how you'd actually balance the budget. You wouldn't have this massive bloated project. So I feel like here's the saddest thing. It's one of these things where it will either happen and it will be so commonplace in 10 years, this episode will seem antiquated, or it'll never happen and you'll never break through the paradigm. Sadly, we'll be back here in 10 years going, why didn't they do that, Nero? And then it'll be the jaded, punished Nero. They're like, Patch, like, yeah, fucking HLT. I remember back in the day, I used to work for those pieces of shit. They kept all the data siloed. That's what I want to see, that Nero with all whiskey and all. Oh, that's what I want to see in 10 years from now.
So I think there's two threads to pull in that. So the first one is like who's gonna make the investment. The other is like who actually could make the investment.
Yes.
So like in theory, if you break the the top 20, 30 organizations who are in Counter-Strike in like buckets, there's like one level of like the richest organizations like the Navis, G2s, Falcons of the world who could easily just invest that money. And like for them, if they did that well, like I don't know, like instead of paying the fourth player the amount of money that they get paid, like would you get more money in like more out of investing in this and picking up somebody? Like probably, I would think.
Yes.
And I think for some of the other ones like FaZe, Navi, G2, like probably not a bad place to invest and try to build something out. The challenge is that those organizations can also just buy. And so this is sort of like when times are good type thing. Like when you have too much money, you don't really know what to do with it, which was the world before COVID for esports overall. So like that's when you could have done this, I think, and you could have gotten funding for it. I think now it's a lot harder for anybody to get onto these things. And like, it's one thing to say that we're investing in this thing, the payback is like 3 years out, 5 years out, whatever, and like it's sort of uncertain, we don't actually know if we get it, but we think we will, and it's years out. And you come to me with that pitch and I say, okay, how much is it gonna cost? And you say, well, it's $500,000 million a year, so we paid 3 to 5 million. I'm like, okay, like which player can we not buy for 3 to 5 million in the next 3 to 5 years that we want? So like you're telling me that we're going to spend over 3 to 5 million in buyouts otherwise, because that's the implication. Like otherwise you don't do it if that's what it costs. Like you have to get there. And I think that one like Academy, that actually, like you said, really had an impact on it. I think if we didn't get the Academy system, people would have been more inclined to invest in something like this, because that just became the funnel. And the way people started organizing their budgets was get 2 cheaper players, 3 sort of expensive experience, like big name players that you can sell sponsorships around that fans care about. And that became the new model. So like, who actually would benefit more from this if you could do it like a little bit cheaper? It'd be like, smaller organizations. So like ENDS, for instance, like that would be like the kind of organization that should do this. On the other hand, like they can't afford to do it because it's too expensive. Like that's not an option. So you're in this situation where like, it's not clear that unless you just have so much money, floating around like in 2019 era, like pre-COVID era, that any of the rich teams is going to do it. The poor teams are not going to have the money to do it. And then the other interesting implication is like, what the payout is. So like if you think Moneyball, the original Oakland A story, you make so much money from being good at baseball.
Oh, sure.
That, you don't actually have to hit it out of the park to be incredible. Like here, you probably have to build like the next best team for the next couple of years.
For now, we're only going to really care about in-game success. Right?
Correct.
You're not going to sell tickets off this, right? So it's only in-game success, yeah?
Correct. And so, like, that's what by the way, like, for, like, Oakland A's, it's kind of the same. It's just in-game success, like, is what turns into the home ticket sales in the playoffs. Like, that's how they make the money. But, like, that's what you need, but you don't get, like, the big payoff, because nobody's gonna, if you find the next Nico, nobody is gonna pay you 10 million for that guy. So like there is no like out, at least in like if you're the Oakland A's and you invest in this stuff, or name whichever team, you can kind of talk yourself into like, hey, like if we find the next like really good quarterback or really good, I don't even know what the roles are in baseball, shortstopper, I think I read somewhere, then in that case, like you'll make your money back from that one player. You need one player that you discover that you under. So like it's so much harder. You have to have so much more consistent success with this. And then the final note is that if you actually got this, then the rich teams of the world, like Liquid, G2, FaZe, whomever, like Liquid might actually be the kind of organization that would invest in something like this.
Sure.
They figure it out. That actually is going to create even more of an ecosystem of the haves and have-nots, because like all of a sudden, so like they have the most money, they have like the most sophisticated like player scouting systems. Like that actually, if you think about it, would be a way for the biggest organizations to sort of strengthen their incumbency in many ways.
Sure.
So like that might actually be the rationale that you would use to justify investing in something like this, because then you sort of put yourself maybe not head and shoulders above, but you just like increase the odds of like always staying a little above where the competition is. And like that would actually, again, like be fairly bad for the ecosystem in the sense that you'd get into an even more of a lopsided situation of like clearly the rich teams who can kind of afford to do whatever, but also now they're better at picking up the up and coming players than the teams who could at least sort of like come up with a couple of new names here and there and then parlay that into team success or player sales.
I really liked in this article that Nero wrote, he did speak to Ash from Gamer Legion, and I was making jokes earlier on, but I mean, obviously this is a team that doesn't have as much money as some of the big teams we've mentioned. They're limited with the players they can get, and Ash was explaining how they use Skybox first. So he uses that data, but he breaks it down. So he's trying to find players, not necessarily just what you would get on HLTV, where most people go, oh, these stats, this player looks crap. He kind of looks at, okay, let's break it down by rounds. Let's look at how they play in ecos. Let's have a look at all of that. Then he finds players that he thinks are underutilized or haven't been seen and are doing certain things that maybe are useful and should be paid attention to. And then from there, that's just basically how he narrows down his shortlist. And then he uses the eye test to determine if it's a good player for him. And I thought that was a really interesting way of using stats and data if you are a team that doesn't have Liquid's scouting ability or a million people that can go out and look for different players. You kind of have to work with what you've got. But on the flip side, I don't think there's a lot of sort of tier 2, tier 3 teams that have a coach like Ash that can do all of that. I think a lot of those teams, the coach is normally like a friend of someone, and we don't actually know what the coach even does. So that becomes another problem as well. But is that the middle ground where you use the data to kind of shortlist, but then you always rely on the eye test at the end of the day to determine if that player is going to fit? And not only an eye test, I suppose it's the conversation right at the beginning of, what's their personality like? How do they come? Yes. How do they fit into this? Yeah. So, I mean, is that kind of the middle ground that we'd find would work in Counter-Strike, do you think?
Well, I think that's sort of what we said at the top of the call, which was that you kind of just use like these high-level stats as a heuristic. Like it doesn't have to be just like rating. It can be like a little bit more detailed, which is what it sounds like it is in this case. I actually think maybe a more interesting like one layer add-on to that would be that you would figure out the things that players actually can improve on with better coaching or teaching. So like, there's like certain things where like Duncan, you remember when Rops was picked up from the FPL when he was like flown to London because people thought he was cheating in FPL games, and like somebody comes up like that, there are going to be things that they're just not as good at, like communication, like team play, whatever. So like if you did this for a prolonged period of time, again, this is where the problem is that you actually need like a decent amount of data that maybe doesn't exist today, just like training players. There's like certain things that you can just like figure out that you can get people to be better at. Like Kawhi Leonard just didn't have a shot when he got into the NBA. Like incredible defender. But like the Spurs just figured out like they had the best like shooting coach in the NBA. Like they can just teach him how to shoot. And like if they unlock that, then like he's gonna be incredible. Even though like when it was the NBA for the Spurs in the finals, he averaged like 12 points or something because he just like could not shoot back then. So like similarly, there's bound to be skills that like some players like maybe they're so important that they actually don't look good at all initially, but there's like very minor things that you can kind of just like teach people in a system. And I think like if you actually had a big enough data set, you looked at a lot of things, this is where you'd have to get to like more sophisticated like stats of like minor things that happen like within round, not just like what happens in eco rounds, but like like specific things that the players are bad at or good at. And if you could break it down to that level, then I think you could figure out like these are the more like teachable things. And then on the other hand, you probably figure out some things where like players just don't get better at this. Like if they can't figure this piece out, like that's kind of where they're gonna max out. Like they're just not gonna get better. Like historically, like nobody gets better. So like, you know, for example, like people like Monesi who are just like incredibly talented, like everybody could see from like the Navi junior days that like he was probably going to be a very good player because he just had so much skill. Sure, like he didn't know all the other stuff yet at the time because he was like 15 or 16 or whatever. Like he was a kid, so like didn't need to, and like he was so skilled that he could just overwhelm everybody. He didn't need to focus on that. You could kind of guess that he was probably going to pick up like some of it. Like he wasn't going to be the same level on everything else and just like play with his skill. Like he was going to learn some of the other stuff. And then like on the polar opposite end, like there's going to be people, or like it doesn't matter how smart they are, if they make every right call every single time, like you just need some level of like hand-eye coordination to be like a serviceable Counter-Strike player. And there's many players in top teams currently who like you typically are like the in-game leaders of the team, who just like literally do not have serviceable level of individual skill.
I always say
like,
this, Carrigan's one of my favorites, mate, but he's actually terrible at CS2. He's really bad, mate.
Yeah,
he's really bad.
Like there's no easier way on some level to like become a professional Counter-Strike player than to just become an in-game leader.
Of course.
Because like that is actually stuff that if you're reasonably smart, you can control. Like you can just put in hours and hours a day into like learning why people think that way. Like what's like the second order effect of this or that, or like how people figure it. Like, you know, you this, what happens on this side of the map. Like that's the kind of stuff you can just learn if you're willing to work hard and are reasonably smart. Like you know, when I played, like, I was never going to be as good as Forrest. Like, I just wasn't. Like, you know, that was not in the cards. Like, it doesn't matter how much I played. Like, could I beat him in a match? Like, yeah. But would I ever be as good individually as him? Like, no, there was no chance. Like, so, like, then there's the fat middle, which is actually the meat of the issue, which is there's a lot of things in there that make the difference between, you know, like a Hooksy level non-in-game leader who just like isn't going to be a pro player for long, like might get a shot but like isn't going to make it, versus who's a good example here? Just name your like fourth best player on like most good teams. Like that's usually like sort of like the glue guy, like good comms, like good teammate, people like playing with him. Like you need those people. Like Apex, if he weren't an in-game leader, like he would not be a top level pro player. Like he just wouldn't. And so if you could figure out like what are the things here, like what can I teach other people, what can I not teach, I think that's where actually you could maybe save yourself a lot of time, because you know it is still just like a lot of finger in the air guessing when you're picking up players. It's like, you know, you play with people in some pugs, you get to know them a little bit, like, oh, you know, he seems reasonable, it's a good head on his shoulders, like he's motivated, but then becomes apparent like pretty quickly in like a different setting that like he just can't get somewhere.
Do you think we'd ever see something like that? I mean, do you think that there is an organization or a media house or someone who would go, hey, this is actually something cool and we should keep building this? Maybe a Skybox builds onto what they've got. Is that something that's going to happen? Or from a business point of view, do you think it's just not financially viable?
So so first of all, like some version of that has been happening for like 20 years. It just hasn't been like systemized and branded and like talked about. Like that is like implicitly or explicitly when like I was picking out players for the teams that I was playing in, like that is like some of the rationale I thought. Like this guy has a lot of skill, like it's not particularly good, but if I can just get him to be like a little bit better on this, then you can make it work. So like I think that kind of trade-off thinking has always been happening. Like it just maybe wasn't systemized or put that way. The interesting thing is if you're a Skybox and you make this all very available, like either the value is all going to be in the analysis. So like, you know, in like you give me the data and Duncan the data and we look at it and we come up with completely different interpretations of that. And like one of those is valuable, one of them is not. In that case, Skybox can be useful, but really only to some of us. But if it's actually that you get like really good insights just out of there directly, then Skybox is actually not going to be useful at all, because now we're again competing on the same level. We have access to the same exact information. So like it's actually all the same. Like I get no advantage from using Skybox or, you know, name your analytics provider in that sense. So like the value needs to be, if it is in the technology, if you will, then it has to be like in-house. It has to be something that I built instead of something that I'm buying from somebody else that everybody else can buy. or it has to be in the analysis of that. So like, like a famous example of financial markets is when the like algorithmic trading got very popular like 15 years ago. They would buy out entire towns between Chicago and New York, so they would get a straighter fiber optic line and save like 2 milliseconds, because like every turn in the fiber optic cable increases the latency, so like your ping. And if I can beat you on every trade by 2 milliseconds, I always know where the price is going 2 milliseconds before you. So I'm just like,
I appreciate the way this
money.
is like a fucking Dexter's Lab idea for how to have a faster computer as well. Okay,
yeah, but so like that's sort of the same. So like what happened when people started doing that is the company that was building the better fiber optic line, they would go to the big banks or like hedge funds, and they would say, Duncan, would you like to buy this? And you would say, I will pay you hundreds of millions for it, but only if you give it to only me, because it doesn't actually help me if we all have the same, like, then I'm just paying you money and we all have the same thing. Like, who cares? That's not actually like, otherwise, like, it's just none of us pay you.
Yes.
Because like, it's kind of the same scenario. Thing. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So,
I will say, I know what he means by that. Like, essentially, like, put it this way, one of the things I do think that is another reason why stats are never work in isolation is, I always say this, right? First of all, the HLTV formula anyway isn't a fucking absolute stat, guys. Please stop treating it like it is. It's already a formula. And since none of us know the exact variables and how the formula is calculated, none of us actually know how much we like it. We just like it when we like it on the play we do, when it's not, we go, oh, it's posted. But like, none of us know that. But anyway, I would say the problem with the HLTV rating, in my opinion, was always this, which is a 1.17 rating is not like another 1.17 rating, because I haven't told you anything else about the player. I didn't tell you what position he plays, who was he playing, what level of opposition. So I would say the flaw currently that we have is, actually, I could use the Gamer Legion example, because if you look how Gamer Legion recruited previously, after they had the first roster that had the Blast Paris run, what they actually tried to do was what every other tier 1/tier 2 team does, which is, hey, we're famous now, let's get names. So what they did was they just picked up a bunch of names that were semi-washed, because obviously they're Gamer Legion, they're not like phased, they can't get the biggest name. So what they had to do was say stuff like, oh, fuck, like, maybe if we get like this guy, Snacks, he can still be good, or like, oh, this guy can roll back the... Right? The flaw with that concept is, like Lurppis was saying, you actually haven't fulfilled any of the criteria that this sort of tech would give you. Like, in that scenario, you almost certainly know Snacks can't be as good as he used to be, and he won't be as good as he used to be, and he's definitely not going to develop in you ways. Meanwhile, if I'd have taken you an identical player to Snacks, and he had the same shit rating, but I showed you using an analyzer, like, actually, he has like extremely uniquely good mechanics, then the difference is Lurppis might take that player, because if he's a smart in-game leader or coach, maybe he can actually train that player to do the things he can't currently do. Here's the difference. You can't teach the washed old player to click heads better. That is not even on the table. So sometimes actually, even going for the big name is actually way worse. Sometimes you'd have been better off. And by the way, I'll give you another example of an esport where I think this essentially did develop. If people don't know, actually in Dota 2, this is basically how Dota 2 recruitment works. What happens is, in the modern day, the newest player, the most rookie player you recruit, sometimes completely out of the equivalent of solo queue, is just the carry players. It's the ones that have the sick mechanics. Because all you do there, if you're a veteran captain, is you look in the solo queue games and you go, look, I can literally see with my eyes, this guy can do like insane mechanical stuff. And then what you do is, or the like supportive in jungle role, that's where the veteran players play. And over their career, they tend to go to those roles like they did in CS, where you become like a fucking anchor and a support. But you don't start out like that. You start out as the star player. And essentially, they understand that certain roles, you only need to sort of level the guy up a bit, or you can do it for him. You can sort of take the decisions for him. But there are certain roles where you can't do the reverse of that. You can't get the best carry from 10 years ago and go, hey, mate, we're going to do everything for you. Can you carry the game? It's like, no, literally, I can't do it with my hands. So I think on some level, I agree with Lurppis. We haven't codified this. There's not a system or a tool for it yet. But people are sort of stumbling in the dark trying to do these things anyway, or some approximation of the concept we're discussing, I think.
And I think if you could give people truth serum on like some of the old roster changes, I think like what people would call like the intangibles, like glue guy, whatever, like a lot of the time it would be like, he's a good communicator, like things like that. Like he'll do the things that nobody else wants to do. And like, he's like, okay at it, whatever, but like, I don't want to do it. So like, we need a warm buddy there who's going to be willing to hold B on Mirage. Because like,
well, if you remember the famous one, Tommy, is the one where, because famously they try to say it to me, but I don't know why you'd even do this. One, you're French, and two, there's alcohol involved. There's going to be banter in it, right? Back in the day, whenever we used to flame Smiths, I know you're going to work soon with Dos, so shout out Dos. We all know what happens if you flame Smiths publicly. When we were all saying, because he was washed at this point in time, people don't know, by the way, Smiths was a great source player. In early CSGO, he was very good. But after a few years, he obviously was there. His primary reason to be there is he's friends with Shocks. That's it. Essentially, we're not even now doing it on his game. We're doing it on like when Shocks seems to frag out when you're there. So we're just like, it's like an aura effect out of Magic the Gathering we're now using. So anyway, he once said to me, like this, Lurppis, by the way, I've no doubt if there wasn't alcohol involved and he didn't have that funny accent, I'd have taken it at face value, which is, it's actually a reasonable point. But he was telling me, you don't understand, Thorin, I am the best flashbang player in the world. And I was like, well, yeah, but the game is about shooting people. He's like, no, but you don't understand. All my opponents, they are flashed the whole time. I'm like, could be true. But you didn't kill them though. He goes, you do not, Thorin, what are you not understanding? He is flashed. He cannot fucking see. What can he do? Nothing. Shocks is killing him. I tell them, come over. And I was going like, look, it could all be true, but at the end of the day, like, is flashbanging that great? Like, but that is the sort of shit they all have some cope like that, Lurppis. They all have some reason, like, that you don't, what, somehow we're never with our eyes seeing the most genius thing there. They're saying the greatest speech bubble of all time while we're just watching the server, you know, and that's what won you the game, isn't it? You know, come on.
People are really good at rationalizing.
They are,
whatever they're, I mean, it's like a biological thing that's evolved over hundreds of thousands.
Because you know,
of
like in that analogy, my all I would say to Smiths there is like, but couldn't we just not flash him as well and shoot him straight in the head? It's like, no, you do not understand. Like, oh, I can't. I get that. I don't understand it, Smiths. I think I'm very aware of that, mate. Painfully aware, some would say.
To put a bow on this whole conversation, I mean, I kind of want to answer the question, if you can, that Nero asked, and he tried to answer as well in his article, which was, why are we still waiting for this data revolution in Counter-Strike?
I think it's just so I actually wrote like a similar thing on HLTV in like 2014. I think I looked it up because I thought about tweeting about it when I saw the thing come out. Like, that's 10 years ago now. So like, that's when it felt like many of these things were sort of like around the corner, like you could do it. So I think it's all been sort of available and like potentially in there for a long time. I think many of the technological breakthroughs in machine learning have made many of these things way more accessible and cost effective now in just like the last 12 months, even 6 months than it was prior. So there's a lot of things kind of moving in that direction where I think it's more likely to happen in the this period, this specific period of time than it was previously, because it was so much harder to do it. But ultimately, I think it comes down to the money issue. So, you know, like the markets haven't been doing, like the markets for financing for these companies. So like, you know, essentially just like startups have not been doing well since.
It's still esports winter, basically, right?
Yeah. So like esports is like a hard thing to raise money for and has been for, it's like 5 years now, almost, gonna be in a couple of months. So it's just hard to put money into something that has a long, indeterminable payout period versus something that you can control. Like, it just, you know, like it essentially is the trade-off between, can I just go buy Nico today or invest $1 million over 2 years and like maybe something good comes out of it? And like, maybe you should just go buy Nico. Actually, that might actually probably would be better for you in many cases. So I just think it's hard to make those investment decisions in like the current climate. That might get better. But there's many other things that have made it a lot more palatable now, just like technologically. It's going to be cheaper now than it would have been previously. I think it's going to be more accessible to more people. Whereas, you know, think about the Venn diagram. Previously, the number of people who are good enough at machine learning and like building those kinds of models was so small that it was going to be incredibly expensive to try to do that. And I think in the last 6 months, 12 months, that side of the Venn diagram has gotten a whole lot bigger. So I think like the thing that you would need for this to become like a broader phenomenon would be just more like all of a sudden like a bunch of money rushing into esports again. And then people would look at like, what's the incremental thing that I could be doing that I'm not doing now? And I think that would be one of the semi-obvious things like sort of next on the list. But you need that other piece of the puzzle. Until then, you know, like if you're like one of the teams doing some of this stuff, like I don't even know that you want to talk about it publicly. Like you probably don't. Like it's actually probably better for you to talk about it in like investor meetings, like tell your investors about it, potential investors when you're raising money. I don't know that you want to, you know, you only want to talk about it publicly if you need that to become like a big story, and that might then be more powerful in like fundraising, like sponsorship interest, etc. But for that, you usually need like some kind of a success story. Like like Duncan's not going to go and make a video on his channel about like all this like analytics revolution based on the fourth best player of a 13th ranked team in the world getting picked up by like some algo. Like that's not exciting.
Sure.
What would be exciting is like the next Rops comes out of FPL because of something somebody built, and like that becomes a story. But I think it probably is something like that where you need some kind of big success story first that kind of like catalyzes the change to get people to do it. Plus the market's getting better.
Yes. I think an angle for me would be like, one, it's similar to what I said when I made the joke about Nero earlier. He's also missing that, like, if this was happening, it's like you say, it would already have happened like 2 years ago. And it's just that we'll only find out in 4 years that Blade did just have this engine the whole time. And really, he did just plug and play. And that's how he knew all these players were the shit. It's just, as you say, what benefit would he have in telling us that? By the way, if anything, he'd be even smarter if you think of like a movie villain. It'd be smarter if he made us just believe that he's just some old boomer working from a notebook and giving all these players papers and that. Like, the joke is, I've always said this joke in the past. If you ever look at those papers, they just say like ipso laura cum. They don't really, of course, but you know, like famous, like, because by the way, at this point, you'd almost be an idiot, Lurppis. Like, even if you're a team that doesn't even play tactical, just bring those papers, just bring a bunch of papers, like, oh, turn 2, chapter 17, just to put the shits up the other team. Why not? You know, so one, there's that aspect which they wouldn't tell us. So again, to Nero, in his world, you know, come by our, like, let's just make the world, let's, you know, like Nero, every Nero idea is like that meme of like what the world would be like if, you know, like whatever you don't like in the world, Elon Musk wasn't in control. But, you know, it's like the space colony in some alternate universe, you know. That's what he's imagining, that we would all just tell everyone, hey, everyone, check out this awesome utility. Whereas I agree with Lurppis, the downside of that would be if all the top 10 teams use the same tool, we've just gone back to square one, and now we all have the tool. It's just who has the best guy who makes the decision at the end of the tool. So, but the other thing I would say is this: I'll use my last take on this show to shoot a shot at the one group of people you're not allowed to shoot shots at, Sam, which is the bloody pro players. So I'm going to say, I think one of the reasons this didn't exist in the past was pro players, because it's only the last couple of years, I know it's been scoffed in the transfer market, that teams have had absolute control, where they really have been able to do stuff that at the time was thought unthinkable. Like, I'll give you an example. People now would be shocked if I told them that that story is real, that Stewie 2K won the major in Cloud9 and just told Jack after signing an extended contract, like, actually, I don't think this team's good enough and I'd just like to join a team and win now. Like, in any normal sport, even in CS now, you just go, I don't give a fuck, shut the fuck up. You just signed an extension. You're here the whole time, bro. Like, listen, maybe that guy can leave, but you're not leaving. You're here for 4 years now. Like, he just got to leave. Like, that's the power of players back in the day, though. Players really did get to say who they play. They could even turn the fans against you. So I will say players would be the hardest people to get to buy into this, because they go off weird, old, antiquated ideas like ego and status. So, for example, I'm not trolling you. If you went to a player and showed him Yimfat, but before he was on mouse, they would never ask for him to be their teammate, because they'd go, who the fuck is he? Some like 17-year-old Finnish kid. No, this guy fucking sucks. They would unironically take like snacks, like Nico does. Because what Nico and them are doing is, like Fallen, they're thinking about when these players were at their peak, how amazing they were. And they're going, the same shit, maybe he can roll back the years or in the right team. Whereas the joke in this analogy is, you'd take it to Yimfa instantly if you knew what you knew now. And if you had an analyzer that told you this guy was the best, you could check his comms and you're good in clutches. So I think, unfortunately, players would have gotten in the way of a lot of this in the past. Like, by the way, that's how I even knew that orgs had full control. There's no universe where people like Simple and Device would ever accept playing with a fucking academy player in the roster that I'm trying to win the major with. You're mad. That wouldn't even be on the table. But it was, because they didn't get to have the say anymore and had people to balance the budget. And that was how, as Lurppis said, that's how some of these orgs cynically were able to pay for people the best salaries in the world. Because, spoiler, that fifth guy who we were all wrecking on social media, yeah, he was making like 5K a month while getting his head banged in by the best players in the world and ruining his whole career. So I do think getting players out the way is a massive plus in that sense, because we don't need them to be on board with this. In fact, eventually, if this approach works, they will just take their place within it. And if they are the star players, they'll know they'll get the value from it. And if they're the up-and-coming players, this is the best part of all. I also hope, by the way, this sort of scouting one day will fix the regions, because I've always said, most famously in North America, it's actually the case now in Brazil, there are certain roles they just don't even have. Like, when I make fun of Fallen, well, one of the reasons he gets to play is Brazil has almost no in-game leaders. I'm not even joking. There's like Big Azera, and he's just told me he doesn't even want to take another offer. So that's it. You got no other options. You got bazillion good players. By the way, you probably got like 1 million good aggressive riflers, but you don't have an IGL. Well, one of the reasons why is because think about the old method of recruiting in CS. You go into a server like an FPL or a tier 2 game, you get the most frags. That's how you get into MIBR or Furia back in the day. In the modern day, if we had these tools, you could actually be told like a real sport, no, just go and find the spot that's best for you. Maybe for you, like I'm giving the analogy here, maybe it's some sort of weird like anchor that doesn't get much kills, but people are going to look at your game with this tool and see that, like, for example, I'll give you the Inters example on Gambit. Maybe you don't get kills, but you just never die. Maybe you just always like survive in a smart scenario, or they can tell from your comms you gave the right comm to the other person that delayed them coming on the site. That's where you can actually play like a not sexy role, but one day get into the top team. So I actually think low key, if we don't have some sort of stats approach like this, more than just I watch demos and he's really good, honest boss, or he used to be good 4 years ago, whatever that Nico says to all those fucking players they recruit. If you're not going to do that approach, I actually think it's necessary you have to have this. I think if you don't, we'll have this kind of scuffed industry like this where it's like half the team. You can just flip a coin. They either completely don't work or they're just good teams. Like there's no in between at the moment.
I'll have one more parting thought, which I'm pretty sure I've said this like years and years ago, so I don't think this is new. But I thought years ago that esports was actually ahead of traditional sports in like the players getting all the power. So like, you know, that's what you actually see in the NBA, for instance, now. But I think the players not having the power is just like a temporary blip because of how the industry is doing. And
you think when the investment comes back,
rain on your parade, I think when there's going to be more money, the players are going to have all the power again. I think that's the like natural equilibrium of the market.
Sure.
So I think like they're gonna have the power.
Because by the way, I will say, as if to do one last dunk on pro players have such a bad conceptualization of their own sport. They essentially do an analog version of the opposite of what these tools would do. They find an old player we all know was really good ages ago, hope he can do it now, he can't, and then he will be bad. Like pro players actually have exactly the opposite of what we're talking about. So I hope they don't get the power, but sadly, I know what you mean. If someone comes back with fucking $10 million to sign all these players, they'll all be back to normal. That's true. Snacks will be in every team again. Don't worry about it. Falling in snacks all day long. 10 more years.
I was going to say, if G2 wins the major, this is going to age really badly for you, Thorin. So
don't worry about it. I'll just make it. Listen, you have to understand. I'll just make the narrative. That's how good Modesty was. He was able to win with one of the worst agils ever. Exactly. I always have an out. Don't worry about that. It's like a good criminal. You've always got to have that like escape route where you leave the jewels and still get out without them catching you. You know,
it's just expected value points. There's no binary outcomes.
Exactly.
Snacks dragged it down, but Modesty was so good.
There you go. There's always an angle.
That they overcame it anyway.
Exactly.
No teleprompter needed.
Remember, it's the same thing with the GL. The better GL does, Alexi B must be a genius. Holy shit, he's getting that guy to win. Fuck it, he must be even more next level than I realised. Okay, I never lose. You have to understand that.
He never loses. There we go. Let us know what you think about data in Counter-Strike, how you think it's all going to play out, and whether you agree or disagree with the gents. And we'll see you very soon for another episode.